Hello, my name is Matthew Petrusek. I'm the Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute here in Rochester, Minnesota, and welcome to 10 Questions. We are delighted to have in studio with us today Mark Bradford. Mark Bradford is our fellow for persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and he's here to do 10 questions with us today. So Mark, I think you know the rules of 10 questions, but just to go over them again, so I'm going to ask you 10 very direct questions intended to elicit as much information as possible from you, and you are only allowed to answer either yes or no. Now, you can answer yes in this respect or no in this respect, but what our goal is to avoid ambiguity at all costs.
Got it.
All right, ready to play. 10
Okay,
questions.
let's go.
Okay, question number 1. Is it ever morally acceptable to seek a prenatal diagnosis of a disability with the intention to abort the baby if such a diagnosis is positive? Yes or no?
No.
No.
A very quick no. It's all in the intention. If you change the question and you ask, is it morally licit to seek out a prenatal diagnosis, but there's no intention to abort, then the answer is yes. Prenatal diagnostics are a tool. The internet's a tool. You can subscribe to an internet platform or service with the intention of accessing pornography, and then that would be an evil act to do that. A prenatal diagnosis gives you information that you can act on in some way as a parent. If your intention is to act on that to take the life of the child, if it's not the child that you want, then you can't. Prenatal diagnosis itself would become an evil end, or an evil means rather, to an end. To an evil end.
So the answer is no, precisely because of the intentionality attached to the question.
Intentionality attached to the question.
All right. Question number 2. So let's set aside the question of intentionality, including the intentionality to abort specifically. If parents receive a prenatal diagnosis that their unborn child has a condition that is incompatible with life, as some doctors put it, incompatible with life, is there any circumstance in which it would be morally acceptable to abort the child? Yes or no?
No.
No.
It's never morally permissible to take a life under any circumstances. It's murder. Can't do it. So another problem with that, I think, is, you're denying the action of grace in a person's life. There are situations that I've heard of where people receive such a diagnosis, and then the time around birth and after birth is really a grace-filled time for a family to welcome the child, to embrace the child, to love the child. You don't then say goodbye to that child with an act of destruction. You say goodbye to that child in your loving arms, in the loving arms of the child's parents. Sometimes even that diagnosis turns out to be wrong, and the child doesn't have a fatal condition, may have a fetal anomaly, but the child will live at least for some time.
Now, some bring up the question of how this is related to children who die in utero. Is there any connection between removing a child who has already passed away from actively killing a child?
No, there's nothing at all wrong with that. Yeah, and in fact, it's medically necessary, right? You can't allow a child who's died in the womb to stay there. It could cause infection for the mother and compromise or really threaten the health of the mother.
Yes, unfortunately, the pro-choice advocates oftentimes try and conflate those two things to scare people. All right, so question number 2 is also a no. Question number 3. So let's think of the perspective of a woman in particular who's desiring to be a mother. My husband and I have tried so hard to have a child, but I have miscarried every time because I'm told of genetic problems with the baby. So I've heard of something called polygenic risk screening that my doctor tells me will make it almost certain that I will have a healthy baby. So, given that, is there any moral problem with doing polygenic risk screening? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. It's only possible if IVF is involved in the process. Because to do polygenic risk screening, I'll explain it in a second, but in order to carry out the procedure, you have to be able to evaluate the quality of the embryo. And the only way you can do that is if the embryo is outside of the body. And if the only way the embryo can be outside of the body is if gametes are collected from the mother and the father, and the fertilization takes place outside of the womb, which is morally impermissible in Catholic moral tradition. So no, it's not okay. Polygenic risk screening is just the next gen process of something called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Polygenic means that many genes can be analyzed, examined, to search out any sort of medical or life-limiting condition that might exist in that embryo. So to do that, you have to have a wide data, a lot of data of genetic conditions that might exist, and then compare the genetic profile through genetic sequencing of the embryo against that to identify potential medical issues with the child. So even before you get to that, it's a hard and fast no from the beginning because IVF is involved in the process, and IVF itself is a moral evil.
Can you say more why?
A moral evil.
Say more why it is evil.
Sure, because it's the fertilization of a child outside the body. It's something that violates the natural process of fertilization, the coming together and the loving embrace of a mother and a father, engendering the life of a child freely as God wills. So accepting what God gifts the family in a child to be born into that family.
Does IVF also necessarily entail the production of embryos that will be discarded or at best frozen and saved? Or is it ever possible for IVF just to generate one embryo that can be implanted?
No, because the chances of a successful fertilization in that case are wrong. So the process, as I understand it, now, full disclosure, I'm not a moral theologian, I'm not a geneticist, I'm not a doctor, but pretty common knowledge that the process of IVF requires sort of a hyperstimulation of ovulation so that the woman produces an excess of eggs. Those eggs then are aspirated from the woman and saved, and then sperm is taken from the man through masturbation, frankly. And then those gametes, the father's germ cells, the mother's germ cells, the sperm and the egg, are brought together in a lab, completely apart from the loving embrace of the couple. So it's not okay.
And that will also necessarily lead to the death of some of those embryos.
Oh yeah, sorry, I got off track.
The ones that are not chosen, right? Yeah.
That's right. So what happens is that they'll fertilize multiple embryos, and then they will score them. And what polygenic risk screening does is it gives you a score of the potentiality of there being a problem with that embryo. So they'll score them according to quality, and then there used to be that they would implant several embryos into a woman's uterus. Now the recommendation is to plant one or two, or at the most, I think, three. Now those embryos are either frozen or discarded that are not implanted. In the days when they were implanting more embryos in the woman's womb, they would then decide which they wanted to keep, and they would go and they would selectively reduce the embryos that had taken in the mother's womb. Barbaric. Yeah.
And I suppose, so it's one thing to say that this can be used negatively to select out for genetic deformities, but I suppose the same technology could be used positively in the sense of, well, I want to have these physical traits. I want to select for a higher probability of a higher IQ. Could the technology also be used in that direction as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a new movement now called the pronatalist movement that's trying to replenish the population because they know that we've put ourselves in a crisis. We're not replacing ourselves. They're committed to having several children, but they're committed to having the right children. So they will have their children using this process of in vitro fertilization. They will screen the embryos for quality. They'll accept the embryos that they want, even maybe not their own gametes, their own sperm and egg. There are catalogs of sperm donors, egg donors. You can go through, like you're flipping through a catalog, choosing the characteristics or the traits that you would like to have for your child. You want a boy, you want a girl, you want a likelihood of blue eyes, you want a likelihood of blonde hair, you want a Rhodes Scholar, you want a star athlete, all these different qualities. But there's nothing in that possibility that will assure that you have that child that you decide you want, because there's always this situation of the environment that the child grows up in.
Now, this points to just the importance of precision in language and understanding, because Catholics may hear a pronatalist movement and say, well, I'm 100% behind that. Yeah. But as you pointed out, the devil's always in the details. So it's always wrong to do polygenic risk screening. Yeah. All right, question number 4. I once heard that Denmark has decided that they're going to eliminate Down syndrome. Is it really possible for any society to eliminate Down syndrome? Yes or no?
Yes. The situation in Denmark is that in 2004, the Danish Board of Health changed their guidance to say that all women should receive a prenatal diagnosis when they become pregnant. Previously, prior to 2004, it was women who were 35 years old and above, because it's older mothers who tend to have children with genetic anomalies. But when they changed that guidance in 2004, within 3 years, in 2007, they had reduced the Down syndrome population by half. So that was in 2007. In 2011, something called non-invasive prenatal screening technologies were released onto the market. And with those technologies, you could take a sample of the mother's blood, and you could identify fetal cells in the mother's blood, analyze those cells, and give a probability of whether or not that child might have a genetic anomaly of some kind. So I think in 2019, there were 18 babies born with Down syndrome in Denmark,
The whole country.
in the whole country. And prior years, there had been 50 before the guidance was changed in 2004. They were averaging about 50 births a year. And of course, in 2004, the guidance just changed. The guidance didn't say no, it didn't all of a sudden say everyone should, it didn't all of a sudden allow for prenatal or recommend prenatal diagnosis. It expanded that opportunity for all pregnant women, not just women over 35. So prenatal diagnosis and abortion of individuals with Down syndrome was already happened previous to that. But they were having about 50 babies born a year with Down syndrome. 2019, that was 18. So there's been an incredible impact. So the question is it possible to completely eliminate Down syndrome from the population? It's possible in theory, I would say. My mind goes to the movie Gattaca that was mentioned here. We were talking about this, I think, yesterday. And the situation there, right? Someone slipped through. There will always be a couple that refuses, I think. And until it becomes compulsory, and it's not compulsory by law to eliminate every baby who's prenatally diagnosed with Down syndrome, it's being enforced through social pressure, essentially. Do you really want to have a child with a disability?
Mm-hmm. Oh, especially if there's government services involved that will be withheld, right?
Yeah, and the expense to the government in a country where the government essentially provides health care, yeah.
Well, this is a separate 10 questions, but that's happening in Canada, for example, on the topic of euthanasia. Yeah. So it's possible, and that's terrifyingly so that it is possible and happening. Yeah. Question number 5. It's common to hear in the culture that the disabled have miserable lives. Are there really some disabilities that make life intolerable for disabled people? Yes or no?
I would say no, but with a caveat. There are some disabilities, of course, that are very, very difficult to live with. But the question always goes back to the accommodations that are given to those people. And I don't just mean, ramps and, these kinds of accommodations. I'm talking about social supports and true relationships that provide support. There was a study that was released of various cases of the implementation of the euthanasia policies in the Netherlands not too long ago that revealed that 39 individuals with autism and intellectual disabilities had requested of the government to be killed, essentially, and were granted. These 39 cases, anyway, were granted. A dominant reason for the request to die was social isolation and loneliness. And the medical board that reviewed the applications for that determined that those conditions couldn't be healed. There was no solution for the condition that the person was living with. As if to say that there's no solution for loneliness, which we would call that community, right? We would call the solution to loneliness being involved in the community. So some people will feel that their lives are too painful for them. But I would say in most cases, The burden of carrying a severe disability for an individual can be alleviated by the love and compassion of their family and those others around them who care for them and help them to understand and feel that their life is worth living.
And so we could say that if there are situations in which there's a subjective expression, someone saying life is not worth living, that's primarily on us, right? That's primarily on our responsibility to make a change to that.
How can we help them? They have this condition. There's, euthanasia is a horror, and I hate the word euthanasia, the good death. A good death is a death like this, I think they were a Dutch minister and his wife, right, who just elected euthanasia and died hand in hand. My goodness, what is that? How barbaric has the culture come that we see a value in helping people die, or outright killing people because they want to be killed.
It's interesting. We'll move on to the next question, but it's really interesting that, I said, well, it's a separate topic for euthanasia, but it's really a sign of the times that our conversation about disability sort of necessarily leads us to the topic of euthanasia because the two are now inextricably linked.
At both ends of life, we started with prenatal diagnosis and now we're talking about euthanasia. At both ends of life, we're deciding what we want to live and what we don't.
That's right. Okay, question number 6. Is the best way to approach those with intellectual or developmental disabilities to just treat them the same as everyone else? Yes or no?
Yes.
Qualified. Yes in this
qualified.
respect, no in this respect.
Because there has to be, the nature of a disability is that it requires some sort of accommodation. Right. So they can't just be treated like everyone else. We have to regard them as everyone else. They're a part of the human family. They're like the rest of us. Mm-hmm. Each of us is abled and disabled, so to speak, in various kinds of ways. Each of us has different kinds of impairments that if it's even our aches and pains or whatever it might be. So yes, we need to treat everyone the same. But there are situations that we have to accommodate in many cases for individuals with disabilities.
So treat with regards to like equal respect,
right?
But different accommodations
when necessary, and giving full agency when possible. That's a big factor in individuals living with various impairments, is that they have to feel like they're still in control of their lives because God gave us dominion over all things in our nature, right? In our creation, at the very beginning of the story of our creation, we were given dominion. And when that dominion over our environment is taken from us, then something is lost within us, and there's an unhappiness and unsettledness that could be the result of that.
All right. So question number 7. Many people feel uncomfortable around people with disabilities. Do the families of those with disabilities have any obligation to prevent their loved ones from causing public or general social discomfort? Yes or no?
Yes. Okay. And I'll qualify that like everything here. People need to learn to be accepting of individuals with disabilities in our church communities and elsewhere. Someone just wrote to me recently and told me that he and his son had come into the church not too long ago, and his son has Tourette syndrome. And if you're familiar with Tourette syndrome, it can cause these outbursts of speech, and often foul and profane and vulgar speech. And his son was not accepted at church, or had a bad experience at church anyway, and left and never came back. So church is not necessarily a place that you want someone with Tourette's to have these outbursts, so there needs to be some prudential judgment there on how you manage that situation in the context of an assembly where you have people there to worship God. People can only tolerate so much. We need to be much more tolerant than we are, but in that situation, if someone rips out with a string of profanity, even if it's beyond their control, it's something that's not appropriate to the situation there. So yes, we do need to be accepting. Yes, parents also need to understand the nature of the disability of their child. And the two need to work together, the parents and the community, to find a place where the two can work together in an environment of charity and respect and accommodation for the family to the extent that's possible. But if the situation is compromising to an extent that's unbearable, the communal worship of the parish, then the parents need to be responsive to that.
Understood. All right. Question number 8. Could the church ever be justified in withholding a sacrament from an individual with an intellectual or developmental disability? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. The church, our minds immediately go to the Eucharist, I think, when we have this conversation, because we do still hear stories of priests who will not allow certain parishioners with disabilities to receive the Holy Eucharist, First Holy Communion, where the documents of the church, the U.S. bishops, and I believe it's even in canon law, that we need to be generous, and if there's a question, our error needs to be on the side of generosity and not on the side of withholding the sacrament from individuals. You know, there are a lot of individuals with disabilities who have strong sensory issues, and it could be that receiving the host in the mouth could cause them to spit it out, and that would, of course, not be a good thing to happen. But going beyond the Eucharist, I would think my mind would next go to matrimony, because it's such a big issue now in the community, in the Down syndrome community, I know, and in others with disabilities as well. And I'm much more reserved on that topic than some people are, because we know that there are certain requirements in the Catholic sacramental marriage, the sacrament of matrimony, that require consent. And that would take a close counseling of a couple to know that they could legitimately consent to matrimony and that they can uphold the responsibilities of matrimony. So in that case, I would say yes, there could be situations where there could be individuals who, people with Down syndrome tend to be very romantic. They want relationships very much. And some are getting married now. But in the Catholic context, we have to evaluate that very carefully, I think. And really in kindness and respect for the sacrament and respect for the person, not allow them to engage in something that they can't fulfill or that they don't understand fully the permanence of. So there are issues there you really have to carefully screen and make certain that consent is fully there.
All right, question number 9. From your perspective, is the church doing enough to include individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities? Yes or no?
No.
No.
In some places, it's doing a pretty good job, but it's very spotty. But I will say this, added to that, Pope Emeritus Benedict in Caritatis Veritate, I think it is, mentioned that we've come to rely too much on the institution to take care of all of these things for us, and we've absolved ourselves of individual responsibility. And the institution of the church can't do everything. The individual responsibility has to be assumed as well to assist individuals in the church in various ways, whatever those ways might be. Welcoming them into the community, providing opportunities in the community, altar servers, various things, helping individual families and taking a child so that a couple can have a night out on their own, or whatever it might be, various ways that individuals can assume responsibility to help relieve the challenges that families with children, young children especially, who have disabilities have.
So the church is not doing enough oftentimes, but we are also the church.
Correct.
And finally, question number 10, little more lighthearted. Are babies with Down syndrome the cutest babies of all? Yes or no?
Do you even need to ask the question, Matt? Of course they are.
I have a hunch. Yes.
Of course they are. They're absolutely adorable. I melt every time I see one.
All right. Well, my mom used to be she worked in a maternity ward when she was much younger, and it's a very common sentiment, and that just makes the tragedy of what our societies are doing to those with Down syndrome and with other developmental intellectual disabilities all the more wicked. So
yeah, we have a fairly new baby at our parish with Down syndrome, and I take up the collection at the mass that we go to all the time with some other guys, and I'm standing at the back of the church during the offertory, and that baby's there. I just can't take my eyes off of him, and I can't
it's
stop
natural.
smiling. It's natural.
It's
yeah.
the natural tendency to care and to cherish these precious lives. Overcoming that with this violence is. So we need to do more as a church. Well, thank you, Mark, so much for your time. And thank you all for joining us once again for 10 questions, and we'll see you all again next time. God bless you.